Hey guys, it's Quickie Baby and welcome back to another quick tank review. This week we are looking at the E100. This was my first tier 10 tank and I feel like I'm really going back to my roots by reviewing it. Now while this tank may not be the heaviest in the game, weighing 60 tons less than the mouse, it packs a serious amount of armor and has a whopping great 15 centimeter gun attached to it, which usually allows it to overpower its enemies. If this sounds like the tank for you, stay tuned, I've got two lots of gameplay coming up for you. And if you have no interest in playing this tier 10 German behemoth, then I will let you know how to take them out effectively on the battlefield. This tank has the second highest hit points in the game at 2,700. That gives you nearly an extra half on most medium tanks. It means that when the going gets tough, you really can weather the storm for long enough, hopefully to be able to take out your opponents. Now the tank is very heavy, weighing in at 130 tons when it's fully equipped, with a very meaty engine propelling at around 1,200 horsepower. Nevertheless, this horsepower to ton ratio is below 10, meaning that the tank does have some issues with its mobility, but not at least with regards to its top speed, which is a very healthy 30 kilometers an hour. Now I say very healthy, and really that's because the other tier 10 German heavy tank, the Mouse, has a terrible 20 kilometers an hour top speed limit. This really is one of the key differences between the vehicles, the fact that the E100 is able to get places so much faster than the Mouse, as well as having a fairly okay traverse speed at 22 degrees a second for a very heavy German vehicle. Now when you look at the armor profile, you really know where that extra weight has gone, and it's got 200 millimeters at the front, 120 at the side, and even the back is 150, with the turret 250 at the front, 150 at the side, and 150 at the rear. Let's just take a quick look into WOT Tank Viewer to have a look at this in some more detail. So here's our E100. And the armor profile with a key at the bottom for you. So the thickest armor on the tank is the front of the turret, which is 250 millimeters thick. It's worth noting that the front is quite well angled, unlike the cheeks of a mouse, which can help you to stop getting penetrated as easily in the front of your turret. I'd like to highlight, however, the turret ring, which is completely flat and 250 millimeters thick along the front, and as we can see, the side is angled, so if the E100 is angling his turret at 45 degrees and you have a precision shot and he's stationary, you could put it in here. There are 250 millimeters of spaced armor directly behind the gun on the E100, dropping down tiers to 200 there and 100 surrounding that. Now behind that spaced armor we can see there is still some rather thick stuff. 210 millimeters surrounding the gun there, but inside this circle it is 0 millimeters thick. So this means that if you're aiming at the 100 and for some reason you want to shoot it directly in the gun, which I don't really recommend because you can always probably hit the turret ring, then hitting it directly on either here or here will mean that you only need to get through 250 millimeters of spaced armor. So the side of the turret and the rear is 150 millimeters thick, apart from this pentagon in the middle, which is only 100. So if you're aiming at the 100 in the back of the turret, this is a very easy place to penetrate it. Now there is a bar of armor on top of the E100's turret, which is 150 millimeters thick. So if you get a chance, you can take advantage of this. Now to have a look at the hull armor. The upper plate is 200 millimeters thick, and unless you're shooting it from above, you've got very little chance of ever penetrating the upper plate on this tank. The lower plate is definitely your key to taking it out frontally. It's 150 millimeters thick, which makes it easily the thinnest armor that will be visible from the front. However, it is worth noting that it is very well angled, and if you try and penetrate it from this angle, unless you've got a very high penetration gun, you're going to fail. You want to try and get the E100 as flush on as possible, and then penetrating here will quite often not only damage him, but also destroy his engine. The tracks on the E100 are exceedingly large. I'm going to hide them to make this easier to see. But it's worth noting that they do count as 40 millimeters of armor on the E100. Down the side of the E100, we can see there is some very thick spaced armor. These parts here at the front are 200, and these side skirts are 60 millimeters thick. If you want to try and get through 60 millimeters of spaced armor, you are still going to have to get through 120 millimeters of side armor on the E100. So you're best to probably aim below this spaced armor and to shoot through the tracks which is thinner, and you've also got a chance of detracking him at the same time. Now, the rear armor on the E100 is surprising. It is 150mm on the hull, and it is quite well angled. What this means is that when you're tanking in the E100, if the enemy does actually manage to get to your side, angle the rear of your tank as well. Do everything that you can to avoid them having a flush, flat shot on your hull armor. The rear is nearly as good as the front, so don't panic and just keep it angled. Unfortunately for the E100, from above, it's not safe from artillery. There's 65mm on top of the turret and 40mm on top of the hull. So don't think for 1 second that just because your tank weighs for 130 tons, if the artillery do manage to hit the top of your tank, you're gonna lose a hell of a lot of your hit points. And you're a very large and sometimes slow target for them, and they will target you. So the E100 has a choice of two guns. It can either use 128mm, which you used on the E75, or you can choose to use the rather unique 150mm. I say it's a unique because it's the highest alpha damage on any of the heavy tanks. And that can be very satisfying because you have a fully traversable turret, and that can be very satisfying because it will allow you to out-trade your opponents. So just to compare the guns quickly, you fire 3 rounds a minute in the E100. Now that's not bad. It may not be Object 268 standard, but as you can see here, I'm showing you the T110E4 gun. You practically have the same rate of fire as a Tier 10 tank destroyer, and remarkably the same aim time too at 2.9. Now the accuracy on the gun isn't brilliant. It's 0.4, but the accuracy on the 128 is barely any better at 0.38. In fact, when we look at this 128mm when it's mounted on the E75, it becomes very apparent that you only get a marginal rate of fire boost to the gun and nothing else. This means that, in my opinion, if you want to use the 128mm on this tank, you're probably better to stay with the E75. The E100 needs the extra DPM, the extra alpha damage of the 150mm, and also the flexibility to fire HE ammunition. But if you thought it was all good news for the 150mm, you'll be very disappointed with the penetration of it. It's 235, making it the lowest penetration of any of the heavy tanks. And just thinking about it for a second, I believe that's the lowest penetration on any Tier 10 tank in the game with its AP rounds. You're going to be sporting, on average, 15mm less penetration than, for example, the IS-7, and 23mm less than tanks such as the T110E5, the FE215B, or the IS-4. What this means is that you generally do have to get the side or the rear of the enemy tank to be able to penetrate them, unless they're giving you one of their weak points. Now the way to compensate for this is to fire heat ammunition. Now the heat rounds will cost you over 4 times as much, but they will have 334mm of penetration. Alternatively, if you don't want to fire heat, but you still want to do damage to a very thickly armored opponent, then you can fire HE rounds, which due to the large caliber nature of this gun have 85mm of penetration. And even if you fail to penetrate, you will still do rather large amounts of splash damage. Depending on the thickness of the enemy tank, you're likely to do about 300 to an E100 as an example if you shoot him in the frontal hull armor or on the tracks, going up to about 400 to 500 damage per shot on a medium tank. And if you hit a very lightly armored tank in the side or the rear, or even some in the front such as the Batchat, you're going to be doing 950 alpha damage, as well as probably taking out most of their modules. And this is one of the keys in the E100, knowing which ammunition you should use against the target. And thankfully, the E100 can carry 50 rounds in its 150mm, which is enough to kill the enemy team probably 2 times over, even if they're all Tier 10. Now the rest of the stats on the tank are fairly standard. It has a kinda healthy turret traverse speed of 20 degrees a second and a standard 400 meters view range. Now one thing I'd just like to highlight quickly that's important on the E100 is one of your driver skills. With frontal transmission, you're very likely to get set on fire if you're penetrated multiple times in the lower front hull of your tank. So I strongly recommend that you use preventive maintenance on your driver as one of the perks. Now remember, this won't work at all until it gets to 100%, so don't waste your time otherwise. Anyway, that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's get stuck into some gameplay. So here we go. I'm defending Corellia in a very nice matchup indeed. The enemy have only got 3 Tier 10s, and then they've only got 4 Tier 9s after that, meaning that half of the enemy team are Tier 8. Now obviously, With the nature of armor that it only works if they fail to penetrate you, the E100 does exceedingly well against lower tiered vehicles. And that's because tanks such as the T-69 literally can't penetrate you nearly anywhere unless they fire heat rounds. And wow, looks like our artillery went into a fairly standard position, and a great job by the enemy artillery to counter battery that GW Tiger within literally the first 30 seconds of the game before he even fired. Well played to him. So back to what I was saying about the fact that the T-69 just can't penetrate me unless he fires premium ammunition, and even then, it's very, very hard for him to. The Tiger 2, the T-32, the KV-4, the IS-3, these are all Tier 8 tanks that have about 225mm of penetration and less. And that is the sweet spot for the E100. As soon as the tanks start to get up to the IS-8 as an example, they've got practically a Tier 10 gun on an IS-8 with 250, and that's where it can start to be a bit more of a challenge for you unless you angle your armor well. So I'm just hoping that this IS-8 is foolish enough to think that he is against 2 Tier 8 heavy tanks. I'm readying up the gun as we come round the corner, and that IS-8, sorry, the IS-3, just lost half of his hit points. And that was a complete, well, a very nearly completely average roll. 749, and half of the hit points gone from the IS-3.